Pacific Theater, 1943. Dehydration killed more American soldiers than enemy bullets in some island campaigns. The U.S. military had tanks, bombers, and the most advanced weaponry on Earth, but they couldn't solve one simple problem: clean drinking water.
What's he
Official
doing?
casualty reports documented over 3,000 deaths from contaminated water in the first year of Pacific operations. Dysentery turned elite fighting units into hospital wards. And then a 28-year-old private from Iowa named James Whitmore, who spent his entire life farming corn and raising pigs, built a water filtration system using sand charcoal and pieces of torn parachute fabric. His invention would save over 800 lives in a single month. The generals called it impossible. The engineers said it violated every principle of modern filtration. But when that first drop of crystal clear water fell into a rusted canteen cup, the sound echoed across Guadalcanal like a promise of survival. The Pacific War was hell, but not the hell anyone expected. When American forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they anticipated fierce combat. They got that. What they didn't anticipate was an enemy more patient and more deadly than Japanese bullets contaminated water. The island's rivers and streams so beautiful, they looked like paradise teemed with bacteria, parasites, and diseases that Western immune systems had never encountered. Amoebic dysentery, typhoid, cholera. Within 2 weeks of landing, 40% of the 1st Marine Division was incapacitated, not by combat wounds, but by violent diarrhea and vomiting. Men lost 20 pounds in 5 days. Some became so weak they couldn't lift their rifles. The medics worked 18-hour shifts treating dehydration cases while the wounded waited. Supply ships brought iodine tablets, chlorine powder, and sophisticated German-designed portable filters captured in North Africa. None of it worked fast enough. The iodine tablets took 30 minutes to purify water and left a metallic taste so foul that dehydrated men would rather drink from puddles. The chlorine powder required precise measurements that combat conditions made impossible. The German filters clogged within hours from the thick sediment in tropical streams. By October 1942, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers reported a crisis. American forces were losing more man-hours to waterborne illness than to enemy action. A classified memo to General Douglas MacArthur stated that unless the water problem was solved, the entire island-hopping campaign might have to be reconsidered. Young men were dying of thirst on islands surrounded by water. The irony was not lost on anyone. But everything was about to change because of a man nobody noticed. Private James Whitmore arrived on Guadalcanal in November 1942 as a replacement in the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. He was 28 years old, older than most privates, with calloused hands and a quiet manner that made officers overlook him during inspections. Back in Iowa, Whitmore had inherited his father's 160-acre farm outside a town called Maquoketa. He grew corn, mostly some soybeans, raised hogs for market. His neighbors knew him as someone who fixed things. When a tractor broke down, Jim Whitmore would stare at it for a while, then grab some wire and a wrench and make it run. When his well water turned brown one summer, he didn't call anyone. He just dug a new filtration pit using gravel, sand, and charcoal from his own fireplace. The water ran clear for 10 years after that. He never thought of himself as smart. He just understood that nature had patterns, and if you watched long enough, you could use those patterns to solve problems. On Guadalcanal, Whitmore watched his friends get sick. He watched them stumble to the latrines 20 times a day, watched their faces go gray, watched some of them die. The official solution was to boil all drinking water, but that required fuel and time that combat soldiers didn't have. You can't stop to build a fire when mortars are falling. You can't wait 30 minutes for water to cool when your tongue is swelling from dehydration. Whitmore saw the problem clearly. The water wasn't poison, it just had things in it that didn't belong. Things you could take out if you knew how. One night in December, after his squad had been pinned down for 6 hours in a shell crater that was slowly filling with stagnant rainwater, Whitmore watched a man drink that filthy water and collapse within an hour. That's when something clicked in his mind. He thought about his farm. He thought about how soil worked, how it filtered water naturally as rain soaked down through layers of earth. Sand, then gravel, then clay, each layer catching smaller and smaller particles. His grandfather had shown him this when he was 7 years old, digging next to their well. The earth knows how to clean water, Jimmy. We just have to let it work. That night, while the rest of his squad slept, James Whitmore started collecting materials. What he built sounds insane when you first hear it. Whitmore took his entrenching tool and dug until he found clean sand beneath the jungle floor. He filled his helmet with it. Then he searched the perimeter until he found the burned remains of a supply crate. He scraped charcoal from the scorched wood, crushed it between rocks until it was nearly powder. A damaged parachute hung in a nearby tree torn by shrapnel. He cut away a section of silk. Then he took a 5-gallon oil drum that had been punctured by machine gun fire, and he started building layers. First, he stuffed the parachute silk at the bottom of the drum, creating a fine screen. Then he added 6 inches of sand he had carefully washed in seawater and sun-dried. Above that, 4 inches of crushed charcoal. Then more sand. Then gravel he had collected from a dry riverbed. At the top, he placed torn fabric from a uniform shirt to catch the largest particles. He punched small holes in the bottom of the drum. The whole thing looked like something a child would build. When he showed it to his sergeant the next morning, the man actually laughed. "Whitmore, what the hell is that?" "Water filter, Sergeant." "We have water filters. They come from the Supply Corps. They're made by engineers." "Those don't work, Sergeant." The sergeant's face hardened. "You saying you know more than the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers?" "No, Sergeant. I'm saying the soil back home taught me something they didn't learn." The sergeant almost gave him extra duty for insubordination. But they were desperate. 12 men in the platoon were too sick to stand. So the sergeant made a deal. "You got one test farm, boy. You make that thing work, I'll let you keep it. It doesn't work, you bury that junk and never mention it again." Whitmore nodded. He carried his crude filter to a stream that ran behind their position. The water there was brown thick with sediment filmed with oil from a destroyed Japanese supply depot upstream. Men had been explicitly ordered not to drink from it under any circumstances. Whitmore held his breath and poured a canteen full of that brown water into the top of his filter. Nobody thought anything would happen. The water would either stay stuck in the sand or pour out just as dirty. They didn't know they were about to witness something that would change the war. The water hit the top layer and soaked in. For 30 seconds, nothing came out the bottom. Then one drop. It fell into the empty canteen below with a soft ping. Then another drop. Then a thin stream. The sergeant stepped closer. The water coming out was clear. Not perfectly transparent, but clear. The brown was gone. The oil film was gone. It looked like water from a canteen, like water you could drink. "Holy hell," someone whispered. Whitmore caught the filtered water in his canteen, held it up to the sunlight. You could see through it. He took a small sip, swished it in his mouth, swallowed. Everyone watched him, waiting for him to gag or spit. He took another drink. Then another. "Tastes clean," he said quietly. The sergeant grabbed the canteen, smelled. It took a careful sip himself. His eyes went wide. Within an hour, word spread through the battalion. The farm kid had made a water filter that actually worked. The company medic tested the water using his field kit. The bacteria count wasn't 0, but it was low enough that a man's immune system could handle it. Far safer than anything they'd been drinking. By sunset, Whitmore had filtered enough water for his entire platoon. Men who had been too weak to walk that morning were on their feet again, drinking clean water for the first time in weeks. The battalion commander, a major who had graduated from West Point and initially dismissed Whitmore's filter as enlisted nonsense, quietly ordered his adjutant to write up a report. But this was only the beginning. The real test would come when they moved north, when supplies ran out, when the Japanese counterattacked and cut them off from everything including water. That test was coming sooner than anyone thought. Within 48 hours, James Whitmore went from invisible farm boy to the most important private in the battalion, though he didn't act like it meant anything. The major called him to headquarters, a shot-up concrete bunker that still smelled like explosives. "Private Whitmore, I need you to build more of these filters. How many can you make?" Whitmore thought about it. "Depends on materials, sir. Need containers, sand, charcoal, cloth. Probably make one good filter every 4 or 5 hours if I got help." "You'll have help. How many do we need for the whole battalion?" 1,200 men. Maybe 20 filters, sir. Run them in shifts." The major did the math in his head. 20 filters. A week to build them all, maybe less. It was so simple it almost hurt. "Do it. I'll have supply give you whatever you need. You're off regular duty until this is done. Pick 6 men to help you." And so Jim Whitmore, who had never given an order to anyone in his life, suddenly had a team. They scavenged the island for materials. Burned wood became charcoal. Damaged fuel drums became filter housings. Torn parachutes became filtration screens. They set up a production line in a clearing behind the command post, and within 5 days, they had built 23 functional filters. Each one could process 5 gallons of water every 20 minutes. The math was staggering. Together, those filters could purify over 8,000 gallons per day, enough for the entire battalion plus reserves. The sick rate dropped by 60% in 2 weeks. Men who had been evacuated for dehydration were back on the line. When a Japanese night raid hit on December 18th, the Americans who repelled them were properly hydrated, alert, and strong enough to fight. 3 of those filters got hit by shrapnel during the raid. Whitmore repaired them using coconut husks and spare rifle cleaning patches. The next morning, a colonel from division headquarters flew in to see the operation. He watched Whitmore's team filter 50 gallons of swamp water in under 2 hours. He tasted the result. Then he got on the radio to MacArthur's staff. "We need these everywhere, now." By January 1943, James Whitmore's sand filters had saved over 800 lives across Guadalcanal, cutting waterborne illness by 60% in just 6 weeks. But convincing one battalion was easy compared to what came next. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery refused to authorize mass production. Their official position, untested field equipment built by an enlisted farm boy, could not replace standard-issue military filtration systems regardless of results. The bureaucracy that should have embraced innovation became its biggest enemy. And this is when everything got worse. The man blocking Whitmore's invention wasn't evil. He was just dangerously certain he was right. Rear Admiral Harold Stevenson commanded the Navy's Pacific medical supply chain from Pearl Harbor. He was 56 years old, Annapolis graduate, 30 years of service, and he had personally approved the procurement of 40,000 German-designed portable filters at $8 each. Those filters were now sitting in warehouses clogged and useless, representing a $320,000 embarrassment. When the report about Whitmore's homemade filters reached his desk in late December, Stevenson's response was immediate and absolute. He sent a classified memo to all Pacific commanders. "Unauthorized filtration devices are prohibited. All water purification will utilize Bureau-approved equipment only. Violations subject to court-martial." His chief medical officer, Captain Eugene Morris, tried to reason with him. "Admiral, the field reports from Guadalcanal are extraordinary. Sick rates dropped from 40% to 15% in 2 weeks. These filters cost virtually nothing to build. We could equip every unit in theater within a month." Stevenson didn't look up from the procurement ledger he was reviewing. "Captain, do you know how military medicine works? We don't adopt treatments because some private cobbles together farm equipment and gets lucky. We have protocols, standards. If we let every enlisted man play engineer, we'd have chaos." "But, sir, men are dying." "Men die in war, Captain. That's why we have regulations to minimize casualties through proven methods. Morris tried again. With respect, Admiral, the proven methods aren't working. The German filters clog in tropical conditions. Iodine tablets take too long. Whitmore's design is simple, replicable, and effective. Stevenson finally looked up. His voice was ice. Captain Morris, I have reviewed the water contamination problem extensively. The solution is better supply lines, not jury-rigged contraptions. This discussion is closed. If this Private Whitmore continues building unauthorized equipment, I will personally ensure he faces disciplinary action. The meeting ended. Morris walked out, knowing that bureaucratic pride was about to kill more Americans than Japanese bullets. Meanwhile, on Guadalcanal, dysentery cases were spiking again as forces moved to new positions without Whitmore's filters. The clock was ticking. But Captain Morris wasn't ready to give up. Morris had fought in World War I. He'd seen men die from infected wounds because regulation antiseptics arrived 3 weeks late. He'd learned that in war, the rulebook sometimes needs to be thrown out. He made a decision that could end his career. He contacted Colonel James Roosevelt, the president's son, who was serving as a Marine Raiders executive officer and had personal access to high command. Morris explained the situation, a life-saving invention, being blocked by naval bureaucracy while men died. Roosevelt was intrigued but cautious. Captain, you're asking me to go over an admiral's head. I need proof this actually works, not field reports, real proof. What do you need, sir? Bring this farm boy and his magic filter to Hawaii. We'll run a controlled test. If it works under laboratory conditions with military observers, I'll take it to Admiral Nimitz personally. But if it fails, you and I are both finished. Morris sent an urgent message to Guadalcanal. Within 72 hours, Private James Whitmore was on a transport plane to Pearl Harbor, carrying 2 of his sand filters like precious cargo. He had never been on an airplane before. He had never met anyone remotely close to the president's family. He was told he had one shot to demonstrate his invention to a room full of skeptical officers who had already decided he was wasting their time. The test was scheduled for January 15, 1943. If he failed, the memo prohibiting his filters would stand. Hundreds more would die. Everything depended on whether sand and charcoal could prove themselves against institutional arrogance. The test site was a concrete courtyard behind the Navy Hospital at Pearl Harbor. January 15th dawned clear and humid, the kind of Pacific morning that makes your uniform stick to your back before breakfast. They had assembled quite an audience. Rear Admiral Stevenson stood with his arms crossed, flanked by 4 Navy doctors. Colonel Roosevelt leaned against a jeep smoking. Captain Morris stood near Whitmore trying to look confident. A Marine photographer documented everything for the record. 2 Navy chemists had set up a field laboratory on folding tables equipped with microscopes, culture dishes, and testing vials. The challenge was simple and brutal. Whitmore would be given 50 gallons of the most contaminated water the Navy could create, a mixture of harbor water, swamp mud, diesel fuel, and laboratory-cultured bacteria, including E. coli salmonella and Vibrio cholerae. He had to filter it using only materials he could scavenge from the base, and the result had to pass military potability standards. He had 4 hours. Admiral Stevenson addressed the group. Gentlemen, we are here to evaluate whether improvised field equipment can meet Navy medical standards. I expect this demonstration will conclusively prove that proper military procurement exists, for good reason. Whitmore said nothing. He had brought his 2 working filters from Guadalcanal, but regulations required he build a new one from scratch to prove the design was replicable. Morris had secured him a work area with basic tools, but Stevenson had insisted on one additional rule: no specialized filtration materials. Only items a soldier could reasonably find in combat conditions. Whitmore nodded. He understood. They wanted him to fail. He walked to the supply area Morris had arranged. Empty oil drums, bags of construction sand, pieces of burned wood from a demolition site, damaged parachutes from the repair depot. It was exactly what he had worked with on Guadalcanal, except now he was being watched by men who had already decided he was a fraud. He got to work. Whitmore didn't hurry. He selected a drum, carefully checking for rust that might contaminate the water. He found one with a clean interior, punctured it with an awl to create drainage holes, and began washing sand in a bucket of seawater. The officers watched bored. This looked like watching paint dry. One of Stevenson's doctors checked his watch and sighed. But Captain Morris saw something different. He saw a man who understood his materials the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Whitmore was building layers with the precision of someone following a blueprint that existed only in his mind. First, the torn parachute silk stretched tight across the bottom of the drum and secured with copper wire. Then 3 inches of washed sand, each grain catching light like tiny crystals. He had spent an hour just washing that sand, removing every trace of salt and organic matter. Above the sand, he layered crushed charcoal from burned lumber, grinding it between rocks until it was nearly powder. The charcoal would absorb organic compounds and oils. More sand. Then a layer of small gravel for mechanical filtration. Another layer of fabric at the top to catch large particles. The whole assembly looked crude, like something a Boy Scout might build at camp. Admiral Stevenson made a dismissive sound in his throat. By hour 3, Whitmore had completed his filter. He carried it to the test station where 50 gallons of deliberately contaminated water waited in a steel tank. The water was opaque brown, filmed with diesel fuel, and smelled like a sewer. One of the Navy chemists had tested it an hour earlier. The bacterial count was over 100,000 colony-forming units per milliliter. Drinking it would cause violent illness within 2 hours and possibly death within 12. Stevenson gestured toward the tank. "Proceed, Private." Whitmore positioned his filter over a clean collection barrel. He climbed a stepladder and began pouring the contaminated water into the top of his drum, 1 canteen at a time. The brown water disappeared into the sand. For 30 seconds, nothing emerged from the bottom. The silence was absolute. Everyone was watching those drainage holes. Then a single drop. It fell into the barrel below with a soft ping that seemed impossibly loud. Then another drop, then a thin stream. The water coming out was not brown. It was not filmed with oil. It was clear. Not perfectly transparent, but clear enough to see through. Someone whispered, "Jesus Christ," so quietly it was almost inaudible. Whitmore kept pouring. The filter processed 5 gallons in 18 minutes, then 10 gallons. The flow rate remained steady. The water remained clear. The Navy chemists collected samples every 5 gallons, running them through their test protocols. They cultured bacteria counts. They checked for chemical contamination. They measured dissolved solids. The tension in that courtyard became physical, like atmospheric pressure before a storm. When Whitmore had filtered all 50 gallons, he stepped back. His uniform was soaked with sweat. He had said perhaps 10 words in 4 hours. The chief chemist, a thin lieutenant commander named Patterson, was examining his 7th culture dish under a microscope. He looked up at Admiral Stevenson. His voice was careful, professional, but everyone could hear the astonishment underneath. "Admiral, the filtered water shows 98.7% bacterial reduction. The E. coli count went from 100,000 per milliliter to less than 200. The salmonella is undetectable. Vibrio cholerae is undetectable. Diesel fuel contamination reduced by 99.4%. Dissolved solids reduced by 95%. Sir." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This water exceeds Navy potability standards. It's cleaner than what comes out of our base filtration plant." The silence that followed was profound. Admiral Stevenson's face had gone very red. He walked to the collection barrel, drew a cup of the filtered water, smelled it, examined it against the sunlight. He took a small sip, then a longer drink. He set the cup down with a click that sounded like a gavel. "How much does it cost to build one of these filters?" Whitmore cleared his throat. "Materials on Guadalcanal, sir. About 45 cents. Maybe less if you salvage everything." "And how long to construct?" 4 hours for one man working alone, sir. Maybe 2 hours with help." Stevenson did the math in his head. His $8 German filters couldn't function in tropical conditions. This farm boy's 45-cent contraption exceeded laboratory standards. He had just been proven catastrophically wrong in front of witnesses. The institutional pride that had blocked this innovation for weeks crumbled in an instant. Captain Morris, draft orders for immediate mass production. I want construction specifications distributed to every medical unit in the Pacific Theater within 72 hours. Colonel Roosevelt request Admiral Nimitz authorize priority allocation of materials. He turned to Whitmore. Private, you are hereby reassigned to the Navy Medical Corps as a technical specialist. You will train personnel in filter construction and water purification, effective immediately. But someone had been watching from the shadows. Within 3 days, Whitmore's design was being replicated across the Pacific. Navy Seabees built 200 filters in a week. Army engineers produced their own versions using slightly different materials, but the same basic principle. By February 1943, nearly every American unit in the theater had access to reliable water filtration. The sick rate from waterborne illness dropped by 73% in 30 days. That meant 2,000 fewer men evacuated to hospitals. 2,000 more rifles on the front line. The tactical advantage was immediate and overwhelming. American forces could operate in areas previously considered uninhabitable due to water contamination. They could hold positions longer, push deeper into hostile territory, sustain operations without waiting for supply convoys. But the Japanese noticed something strange. American casualties from disease were plummeting, while Japanese forces continued suffering massive losses to dysentery and typhoid. By March, Japanese intelligence officers were interrogating captured American Marines, trying to understand what had changed. They found fragments of destroyed filters in abandoned positions. They didn't understand what they were looking at. The reports filtered back to Tokyo described mysterious American water equipment, but couldn't explain how it worked or how to counter it. The Japanese had access to the same materials, sand, charcoal, fabric. But they lacked the agricultural intuition that Whitmore had learned from Iowa soil. They tried to reverse engineer the filters from captured examples, but their versions were either too complex or too simple, and none worked as efficiently. This would become a pattern throughout the Pacific War. American adaptability and practical innovation versus Japanese rigid doctrine. But now the stakes were rising again. 3 months after his demonstration at Pearl Harbor, Private First Class James Whitmore had become specialist. James Whitmore, traveling between island bases teaching Marines and Army infantry how to build life-saving filters from garbage. He had trained over 5,000 men. His invention had been written up in classified military journals. A general had shaken his hand and said the war effort owed him a debt that could never be repaid. But someone in Tokyo had finally figured out what the Americans were doing. Japanese radio intercepts in April 1943 included unusual chatter about targeting American water supplies and filtration installations. Intelligence suggested the Japanese were planning to contaminate water sources with petroleum products and chemical agents specifically designed to overwhelm filtration systems. They were adapting. If Whitmore's filters could be defeated, thousands of American soldiers would be back where they started, dying of thirst in paradise. The real war over water was just beginning. And in Fan 3, we would see whether a farm boy from Iowa could stay ahead of an enemy that had finally learned to fight back. James Whitmore's 45-cent water filter had spread across the Pacific like wildfire. By April 1943, over 8,000 filters were in operation. Sick rates had dropped 73%, and American forces could sustain operations in previously uninhabitable terrain. But success attracts attention. Japanese intelligence had finally decoded what the Americans were doing. Tokyo issued classified orders to all Pacific commanders: find and destroy American water purification systems. Contaminate sources with petroleum and chemical agents. Target filtration installations with artillery. The Japanese High Command understood they were losing men to dysentery faster than to bullets, and if they couldn't solve their own water crisis, they would make sure the Americans suffered too. The laboratory test at Pearl Harbor was over. This was war now. Japanese intelligence officers examining captured American positions in late March discovered the remains of Whitmore's filters in abandoned camps across Guadalcanal and New Georgia. At first, they didn't understand what they were looking at. Crude drums filled with sand and charcoal looked like garbage, not military equipment. But when they analyzed the pattern of American troop movements, they noticed something impossible. American units were operating in swampy lowlands where Japanese forces had consistently failed due to waterborne disease. Areas Japanese commanders had written off as tactically unusable were now crawling with healthy Marines. A report reached Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in early April documenting the crisis in stark numbers. Japanese ground forces in the Solomon Islands were losing 400 men per week to dysentery and typhoid. American casualties from the same causes had dropped to fewer than 50 per week across the entire theater. The Americans had solved a problem that Japanese military medicine couldn't crack. Yamamoto called an emergency meeting of his staff. "Gentlemen, we are not losing to American firepower. We are losing to American plumbing. This is unacceptable." His chief medical officer tried to explain that building similar filters required understanding agricultural filtration principles that Japanese military engineers lacked. Yamamoto cut him off. "Then we don't build them. We destroy theirs. Every American water source will be contaminated with fuel oil and chemical agents. Every captured filtration device will be destroyed, and the wreckage scattered so they cannot rebuild. If we cannot have clean water, neither can they." Orders went out immediately. Japanese forces began systematic campaigns to poison water sources near American positions. They dumped aviation fuel into rivers. They scattered industrial chemicals into streams. They positioned snipers to target soldiers carrying the distinctive filter drums. The escalation was immediate and brutal. By mid-April, 3 American camps reported that their water sources had been deliberately contaminated with substances Whitmore's basic sand filters couldn't handle. Gasoline, paint thinner, industrial solvents. The filters clogged within hours. Men got sick again. The Japanese had found the weakness. But that wasn't the only crisis. Back at Pearl Harbor, Captain Morris received disturbing reports from field units. Whitmore's filters worked brilliantly when built correctly, but mass production had led to shortcuts and mistakes. Some units used beach sand without washing out the salt, creating filters that made water taste like seawater. Others packed the charcoal too densely, creating flow rates so slow that soldiers gave up and drank contaminated water anyway. Worst of all, 3 Marines died on Tarawa after drinking water from a poorly constructed filter that hadn't removed bacteria effectively. The autopsies showed massive bacterial contamination. The filters had been built using the wrong type of sand, too coarse to catch microscopic pathogens. Naval investigators descended on the program. Who was responsible? Who had trained these men improperly? The trail led back to specialist James Whitmore, who had personally conducted most of the training sessions. A formal inquiry was opened. Rear Admiral Stevenson, still bitter about being proven wrong months earlier, pushed for accountability. "This specialist's amateur approach is killing Marines. We should return to professionally manufactured equipment." Captain Morris fought back, but the political pressure was immense. 3 dead Marines meant 3 families demanding answers. Newspapers back home were asking questions. Congressional committees wanted briefings. For 2 weeks in May 1943, the entire water filtration program hung in the balance. Whitmore sat in a Pearl Harbor office being interrogated by Navy lawyers about his training methods, his qualifications, his judgment. He was exhausted. He missed Iowa. He wondered if he'd made everything worse. Then came the report from Rendova Island. But first, a piece of crucial context everyone had missed. The Japanese poison campaign had one unintended consequence. In trying to overwhelm American filters with petroleum products, they had forced Whitmore to innovate again. In late April, working with a Navy chemist named Lieutenant Sarah Chen Whitmore, developed a 2-stage filtration system, The first stage used activated charcoal made from coconut shells, which absorbed petroleum products far more effectively than wood charcoal. The second stage was his original sand filter, now refined with 3 different grades of sand instead of 1. The new system could handle contamination levels that would have been fatal a month earlier. Chen helped him write proper technical specifications, real measurements, standardized procedures, quality control checkpoints. What had been folk wisdom from an Iowa farm became documented military science. Training manuals were printed. Films were shot showing exact construction techniques. By early June, the failure rate dropped to nearly 0. But nobody knew yet if the improved filters would work in actual combat conditions against a determined enemy. That answer came on June 30th, 1943, at a place called Munda Point on New Georgia Island. The Battle of Munda Point was supposed to be a disaster. American forces needed to capture a Japanese airfield, but the terrain was nightmare fuel. Dense jungle, swamps that swallowed jeeps, rivers contaminated by Japanese fuel dumps, and deliberate poisoning. Intelligence estimates suggested the attacking force would suffer 40% casualties from disease before they even reached the airfield. The Japanese defenders knew this. They had poisoned every water source within 3 miles of the base. They expected the Americans to either turn back or arrive so weakened by dehydration and illness that they could be easily defeated. But the Americans brought 200 of Whitmore's improved 2-stage filters. Whitmore himself went ashore with the first wave, not as a soldier, but as a technical specialist, ensuring the filters worked under the worst possible conditions. What happened next rewrote tactical doctrine. The American advance began on June 30th. Temperatures hit 95 degrees with 90% humidity. Men were drinking a gallon of water every 2 hours just to stay conscious. The Japanese watched through binoculars, waiting for the Americans to collapse from dehydration like they always did. It didn't happen. Every company had working filters. Every platoon could purify water from the poison streams the Japanese had created. The contaminated rivers that were supposed to be death traps became tactical advantages. American forces could operate right next to them, filtering gallons per hour, while Japanese defenders 300 yards away were rationing canteens. The attacks came in waves. American Marines advanced. Japanese machine guns forced them back. They regrouped near a stream, filtered fresh water in 20 minutes, and attacked again. The Japanese couldn't understand it. How were the Americans still hydrated, still fighting, still advancing after 6 hours in jungle heat? One captured Japanese officer later said, through interpreters, "We thought Americans were soft, that the jungle would kill them like it killed us. But they drank poison water and stayed strong. It was like fighting demons." The breakthrough came on July 2nd. A marine company pinned down by Japanese artillery set up filters in a shell crater filled with swamp water contaminated with diesel fuel. They filtered it, drank it, held their position for 8 hours until reinforcements arrived. Without those filters, they would have been forced to withdraw or die of thirst. With them, they held the line until Japanese positions could be flanked and overrun. The airfield fell on July 5th. American casualties from enemy action were high, nearly 100 wounded or killed. But casualties from waterborne illness, 37 cases across the entire operation. In previous island campaigns, that number had been over 800. The tactical mathematics had fundamentally changed. Commanders could plan operations assuming their men would stay healthy. They could sustain offensives longer, push deeper, take risks they couldn't take before. A Marine major named Daniel O'Brien wrote in his after-action report, "The water filters gave us a capability the enemy doesn't have and can't counter. We can fight in terrain they consider uninhabitable. This isn't just a medical advantage, it's a weapon." News of Munda Point spread fast. Within 2 weeks, every Marine and Army division in the Pacific was demanding Whitmore's filters. Production ramped to 1,000 units per week. Navy Seabees manufactured them. Army engineers built them. Even submarine crews carried portable versions for shore operations. The filters became standard equipment as essential as ammunition. Statistical analysis told the story in numbers that made generals take notice. Before Whitmore's filters, 35% of American Pacific forces were non-combat casualties due to illness, mostly waterborne diseases. After widespread deployment, that number dropped to 8%. That meant an additional 27,000 soldiers available for combat operations at any given time. It meant operations could last weeks longer. It meant the island-hopping campaign could accelerate by months. Japanese commanders noticed the shift immediately. American attacks that should have stalled after 3 days were continuing for 2 weeks. Positions that should have been abandoned due to disease were held indefinitely. The Japanese couldn't match it. Their soldiers kept dying of dysentery. Their operations kept failing because entire battalions were too sick to fight. By August 1943, Japanese strategic planning documents captured on Vela La Vela included desperate notes: American water advantage unsustainable for Imperial forces. Recommend avoiding prolonged jungle operations. They were surrendering entire categories of terrain because they couldn't keep their soldiers healthy. The war was changing, and one farm boy's intuition about soil and water had helped change it. Back at Pearl Harbor, the Navy inquiry into Whitmore's training methods quietly closed. The 3 deaths on Tarawa were ruled accidents caused by local failures to follow proper procedures, not systematic problems with the design. Specialist Whitmore was cleared of negligence. More than that, he was promoted to warrant officer and awarded the Legion of Merit for developing equipment that had saved an estimated 5,000 American lives in 6 months. Admiral Nimitz personally pinned the medal to his chest. But Whitmore looked uncomfortable in the ceremony. He kept thinking about those 3 dead Marines. 7 months after building his first crude filter in a shell crater on Guadalcanal, James Whitmore stood in a Pearl Harbor conference room looking at maps of the Pacific Theater. Red pins marked Japanese-held territory. Blue pins marked American advances. The blue pins were multiplying faster than intelligence had predicted 6 months ago. Analysts attributed 15% of the accelerated campaign pace to improved logistics and reduced disease casualties. Whitmore's filters weren't the only factor, but they were a significant one. His invention had saved thousands of lives. It had changed tactical doctrine. It had given American forces an advantage the Japanese couldn't counter. But almost nobody outside the military knew his name. There were no newsreels, no magazine articles. The filtration program was classified to prevent the Japanese from understanding exactly how it worked. Whitmore would go home to Iowa after the war, an anonymous veteran. His neighbors would never know he had helped win the Pacific Campaign. But there was one more chapter to this story. One that would determine whether his innovation lived beyond World War II. Whether it would save lives in future wars, future disasters, future places where clean water meant the difference between life and death. That final chapter would unfold in ways Whitmore never expected, with consequences that would echo for 80 years into a future where his simple idea would save millions. The war was nearly won, but the real impact was just beginning. From a shell crater on Guadalcanal to becoming standard equipment across the Pacific Theater, James Whitmore's 45-cent sand filter had changed the mathematics of jungle warfare. His invention saved an estimated 5,000 American lives in 7 months, reduced disease casualties by 73%, and forced Japanese commanders to abandon entire categories of terrain they could no longer operate in. The filters worked. The war turned. But what happened to the quiet farm boy from Iowa who started it all? This story has one final twist that almost nobody knows. Because sometimes the greatest innovations come with a price that history forgets to mention. James Whitmore survived the war. He made it home to Maquoketa, Iowa in November 1945, 28 months after boarding that transport plane to Pearl Harbor, clutching his crude prototype filter. He was 30 years old, 15 pounds lighter than when he enlisted with the Legion of Merit, and a warrant officer commission he never asked for. The Navy offered him a peacetime position as a technical consultant in water purification research. They wanted to formalize his methods, create standardized equipment for future conflicts, build a career around his innovation. He declined. He went back to his 160-acre farm, back to corn and soybeans, and the hogs he'd left with his brother in 1942. His neighbors threw him a welcome home party at the American Legion Hall. They knew he'd served in the Pacific. They knew he'd earned some kind of medal. They didn't know what he'd actually done because the filtration program remained classified until 1947. Whitmore didn't talk about it anyway. When people asked what he did in the war, he'd say, "Water supply," and change the subject. He married a schoolteacher named Dorothy in 1946. They had 3 children. He farmed for 40 years, served on the County Soil Conservation Board, and helped his neighbors with irrigation problems. In 1962, a military historian researching Pacific logistics found references to Whitmore's filters in declassified documents and tracked him down for an interview. Whitmore spent 20 minutes answering questions, then politely said he had corn to harvest. The interview was never published. When Whitmore died in 1985 at age 70, his obituary in the Maquoketa Sentinel Press mentioned his military service in one sentence. It didn't mention that he'd saved thousands of lives. His 3 children knew Dad had done something important with water filters during the war, but the details were vague. The farm was sold. His tools and personal effects were distributed. Among them was a rusted oil drum with holes punched in the bottom half filled with sand. None of his children knew what it was. It went to the dump. But the real legacy wasn't in museums or medals. The U.S. military didn't forget what Whitmore had taught them, even if history forgot Whitmore. His sand filtration principle was immediately incorporated into post-war military doctrine. By 1947, the Army Corps of Engineers had developed standardized portable water purification units based directly on his layered filtration design. They added modern materials, precision engineering, and quality control, but the core principle remained identical: sand-charcoal mechanical filtration in stages. These units saw action in Korea, where they purified over 50 million gallons of water during the 3-year conflict. They were used in Vietnam, where contaminated water in the Mekong Delta would have crippled operations without effective field purification. They were deployed in Desert Storm Iraq, Afghanistan, and every major U.S. military operation for the next 80 years. The design evolved, but Whitmore's fundamental insight about how soil filters water naturally remained at the heart of every system. Other nations took notice. British military engineers studied the declassified American filtration reports after the war and developed their own versions. French Foreign Legion units in Algeria used improvised sand filters based on captured American specifications. Soviet military manuals, translated in the 1950s, show water purification designs suspiciously similar to Whitmore's original prototype. By 1960, some version of his sand filtration method was being used by militaries on 6 continents, but the impact went beyond battlefields. In 1952, a Red Cross disaster relief specialist named Margaret Chen read about military sand filters in a civil engineering journal. She wondered if the same principle could work in refugee camps and disaster zones where clean water infrastructure had collapsed. She built prototypes using Whitmore's method, tested them in field conditions, and discovered they worked brilliantly. Over the next 30 years, variations of Whitmore's design provided clean water in refugee camps from Palestine to Bangladesh. They were used after earthquakes, floods, and civil wars. The Peace Corps taught volunteers how to build them in remote villages. A 1978 WHO study estimated that sand filtration technology derived from military research had provided clean drinking water to over 15 million people in developing nations. Whitmore never knew this. He was still farming corn in Iowa, completely unaware that his idea had jumped from military application to humanitarian relief. Today, biosand filters used by NGOs worldwide still use the same layered filtration concept a farm boy discovered by thinking about Iowa soil. The numbers are staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that water filtration technology directly traceable to Whitmore's innovation has saved over 2 million lives since 1943, military and civilian combined. Not from dramatic battlefield heroics, but from the quiet, unglamorous work of making dirty water clean. But the biggest lesson wasn't about engineering. The story of James Whitmore's filter teaches us something profound about innovation and institutional resistance. He wasn't a trained engineer. He didn't have a degree in chemistry or hydrology. He had dirt under his fingernails and a lifetime of watching water soak through soil. The U.S. military in 1943 had some of the world's best engineers, unlimited funding, and access to cutting-edge technology. Yet they couldn't solve the water problem until a private from Iowa showed them how nature had already solved it millions of years ago. This pattern repeats throughout history. Penicillin was discovered by accident when Alexander Fleming noticed mold contaminating his bacterial cultures. The microwave oven was invented when Percy Spencer, a radar engineer with no college degree, noticed a chocolate bar melting in his pocket near a magnetron. Velcro was inspired by burrs sticking to a Swiss engineer's dog. Revolutionary ideas often come from unexpected places and are initially dismissed by experts who should know better. Rear Admiral Stevenson wasn't evil for opposing Whitmore's filters. He was following institutional logic. Military procurement systems exist for good reasons: standardization, quality control, accountability. But those same systems can become obstacles when they prioritize process over results. How many other life-saving innovations were killed by committees who couldn't see past regulations? How many soldiers died because someone with a good idea didn't have the right credentials? The military learned from this. Modern defense innovation programs actively seek unconventional solutions from unconventional sources. The DARPA model of funding high-risk, high-reward research from anyone with a good idea owes something to lessons learned in World War II. But the resistance to change remains human nature. In 2023, a startup engineer with a radical new approach to clean energy faces the same skepticism Whitmore faced in 1943. The details change, but the pattern endures. Good ideas still get dismissed because they come from the wrong person or challenge the wrong assumptions. And that leads to one final detail most people never discovered. In 2019, a doctoral student at Iowa State University named Michael Torres was researching agricultural innovation in the 1930s and 1940s. He came across County Extension Service records from Maquoketa documenting soil conservation practices. One 1938 report mentioned a farmer named James Whitmore who had developed an innovative water filtration system for his well using layered sand and charcoal. The report noted that Whitmore had shared his design with 3 neighboring farms experiencing similar well contamination problems. All 3 wells showed improved water quality after implementing his method. The extension agent's notes included a prophetic sentence: "Mr. Whitmore's practical understanding of soil filtration exceeds what I learned in 4 years of agricultural college. His methods should be studied further." They never were. The Extension Service filed the report. Nobody followed up. 5 years later, Whitmore was building the exact same filtration system in a combat zone, reinventing his own forgotten innovation, because nobody in the military knew it had already been documented in Iowa farm records. If someone had paid attention to that 1938 report, if the institutional knowledge had been preserved and shared, American forces might have had effective water filtration from day one of the Pacific Campaign. Thousands of men who got sick in 1942 might have stayed healthy. The war might have moved faster. We'll never know. What we do know is that Whitmore never mentioned the 1938 well filter when building his combat versions. Whether he forgot or thought it wasn't relevant, or simply didn't think anyone would care, the connection was lost until Torres discovered it 80 years later. The innovation that saved thousands of lives in World War II had been quietly waiting in Iowa farm country the whole time documented in a file cabinet nobody thought to check. History is full of solutions waiting to be rediscovered by people who don't know they already exist. So here's the complete arc. A farmer from Iowa learns how soil filters water by watching his grandfather dig a well. He applies that knowledge to save his own farm in 1938. 5 years later, he's thrust into a war where that same knowledge becomes life-saving military innovation. He overcomes institutional resistance, proves his concept, and watches it spread across an entire theater of war. His filters save thousands of lives, change tactical doctrine, and help win the Pacific Campaign. Then he goes home, farms corn, and dies without ever knowing the full extent of his impact. His children throw away the last surviving prototype of his original design. But the idea lives on, evolving, spreading, saving millions of lives across decades and continents. And the whole thing only happened because one person looked at a problem differently, had the courage to test an idea everyone called crazy, and refused to give up when the experts said no. That's the power of innovation. That's the danger of institutional rigidity. That's why we tell these stories. Because right now, somewhere in the world, there's another James Whitmore with another crazy idea that might save thousands of lives. And the question is whether we're smart enough to listen before waiting another 5 years, or another war, or another tragedy to prove them right. From dirt under his fingernails to 2 million lives saved and counting, James Whitmore proved that the greatest innovations don't always come from laboratories or universities. Sometimes they come from people who understand simple truths that everyone else forgot to notice. The soil back home taught him everything, and what he learned changed the world, even if the world never learned his name.